Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Red Deer Museum and Art Gallery. We are proud to host a virtual tour today with Xavier Gélinas, the political history curator from the Canadian Museum of History. I will give him a formal introduction in a moment. I just want to welcome everybody who might be joining online to view this presentation. This presentation will probably go for approximately an hour. Xavier will speak on the Lost Liberties War Measures Act that is currently on at the Red Deer Museum. And we will have Kim in the galleries giving us a little walk, so you'll have a tour of the exhibit. And when we're done with that, there will be time for questions and answers. I have a few questions posed directly to Xavier Gélinas, but you are welcome at any point in the tour to type in your questions into the chat box. And at the end of the virtual tour of the exhibit, we can address any of the questions that you have and he can answer them. So I will begin with some land acknowledgements. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of Treaty 6, the gathering place of the Nehewak Cree, the Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Nakota Sioux, located north of the Red Deer River. We also live on the traditional grounds of Treaty 7, the gathering place of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as Yehi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and all the people who make their homes in Treaty 7 south of the Red Deer River. So we are so happy to have Xavier Gélinas here with us today in the studio. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in history from the University of Montreal and a PhD from the York University. Xavier Gélinas has been the curator of political history at the Canadian Museum of History since 2002. His work involves enriching and documenting the collections of artifacts and documents in his field while enhancing public knowledge of Canada's political history through exhibitions, publications, and other activities. From 2002 to 2012, Xavier Gélinas was a curator for the exhibits that are, if you've been to the museum, Face-to-Face, the Canadian Personalities Hall. In 2012, he developed another exhibit, A Queen and Her Country. He was also part of the curatorial team creating Canada History Hall, the museum's signature gallery at the History Museum. Lastly, Xavier Gélinas is a co-curator of Lost Liberties, the War Measures Act, presented in the museum at 2001 to 2002 or 2022, and it's now currently traveling across Canada, and it is in the Red Deer Museum and Art Gallery until early January of 2024. So we're very happy to have it. I will add on him in the galleries here. And when you're ready, Xavier, we're happy to listen to you giving a tour of this exhibit that we have in our galleries currently.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for the invitation, and hello to you and to our listeners. I regret not being able to be with you geographically in person, but virtually and intellectually. Pleased to be your guest. Yes, this exhibition, which used to be presented at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, was planned actually from the summer of 2018. And initially, the project was to concentrate, among other things, on the incoming anniversary of the October crisis in Quebec, which occurred in 1970, and which would count its 50th anniversary in 2020. But the museum decided to broaden the topic of its exhibition, because actually the War Measures Act, although it's a very modest statute in dimension, it has merely 4 pages of text plus the signature. We realized that the War Measures Act was applied 3 times in Canadian history, all 3 times in context of war or very serious national crisis. and that this act, the War Measures Act, in fact, is like an umbrella act explaining many darker chapters of our history. And this is what the exhibition covers: the First World War, the Second World War, and the October 1970 crisis in Quebec. Each of those three historical eras, marked, of course, by strife and violence and problems, and also by the concrete application of that act. So the War Measures Act, if so to speak, the hero or the heroine or the main character of the entire exhibition. You see it here in a display case. It's merely 4 pages long. And the title of the act, which was adopted in August 1914 by our Canadian Parliament, the title of the act sounds very innocuous to our ears: an act to confer certain powers upon the governor in council and to amend the Immigration Act. When you just read the official full title, this is not a very threatening act. However, the very first clause gives the possible summary. This act may be cited as the War Measures Act 1914, and that's the way the act has remained in Canadian memory. It was applied 3 times then during the First World War, from the absolute beginning, August 1914, until late after the formal end of hostilities, 1920, if I'm correct. Then it was applied again as soon as the Second World War erupted, 1939 to 1945. And then it was adopted and applied, for a third and last time in October 70 for 3 months. Why is this act so important in Canadian history, especially for its mere 4 pages of text? Essentially, it's an act that allows the government to dispense with all sorts of civil liberties which countries of Anglo-American legal tradition have been enjoying since the Middle Ages. Since the Magna Carta of the 13th century, if not before, our countries have enjoyed increasing measures of certain civil liberties, that is, rights and liberties that no government could violate. But the War Measures Act enables very legally the government of the day to dispense with all these civil rights and civil liberties. Essentially, one of the clauses is quite blunt and direct enough. It says that the governor in council, that's a fancy legal term to mean the government, may make any decree or order in council concerning censorship, arrest, detention, exclusion, and deportation of individuals, controls of the harbors, ports, and waters, movement of vessels, transportation by land and water, the control of the transport of person and things, trading, exportation, production, manufacture, appropriation, disposition of property, everything. Essentially, it means then that without having to resort to formal parliamentary approval and debate, the government is legally enabled to imprison any group of persons, to appropriate anything, to deport people, to control the harbors, the production, factories, plants, farms, land, and so on. So that's a huge amount of powers that the government gave itself. At the beginning of the war, things were, of course, uncertain. Nobody had, of course, been involved yet in a world war of that scale. Nobody could predict how long it would last and how it would unfold. Therefore, the government wanted to ensure itself that it had all the levers at its disposal. And believe me, the government used all of these levers. The same thing happened at the Second World War, and it happened for a third and last time in 1970, this time with the government using the powers more in a more moderate way, but nevertheless invoking the act again. So that's the story of the entire exhibition, and it is devoted into three historical sections, where what the camera is showing now is the first of three such sections, the First World War. Since the War Measures Act enables the government to do everything or anything, of course, we curators had to select a few topics. So the exhibition gives a general context of the war, because it is one thing to talk about the War Measures Act and the very stark and dark measures that followed from it. But in all fairness to history, one has also to understand the context. A war of massive proportions, a significant investment of money and manpower and agricultural and factory resources by Canada, by Britain, by all allies, a general upheaval on the world stage. So the exhibition tries to give a general context to the times. Nevertheless, it focuses on what the War Measures Act unfortunately enabled the government to do. Of particular focus for us on the First World War section of the War Measures Act story is the very dramatic story of internment. One has to realize that Canada was then host to a certain number of people coming from Europe, coming from countries which happened to be at war against Canada in 1914. In 1914, the German Empire was at war against Canada. The Empire of Austria and Hungary was also at war, and the Ottoman or Turkish Empire was also at war against Canada. As a result, all Canadian residents coming from these countries and from these hostile empires were deemed, in the unsavory language of the time, enemy aliens. All of them had to register to be taken, to be traced and to be traceable by the government. Unfortunately, the Canadian government chose to intern about 8,500 people of Canadians coming from hostile nations. Although many of these Canadian residents had been living in Canada for 5, 10, or 5 years, and many of these new or recent Canadians, of course, they had national or ethnic links with their countries or empire of origin. But by default, one could not question their loyalty to their new country, Canada. Indeed, if these people had decided to emigrate precisely from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire or from the German Empire, it is because they sought a better life in Canada. Among these more than 8,000 people who were interned in Canada for many years, not just for quick interrogation and vetting. Unfortunately, for the internment camps opened in 1914, 1915, and the last one formally closed in the summer of 1920. So many people spent 4, 5 years and more in the internment camps. Out of the more than 8,000 people, a solid 6,000 individuals were of East European descent and particularly of Ukrainian ancestry. Why so? Not particularly because of anti-Ukrainian bias from old stock Canadians of the time, but because through the accidents of geography and history, most Canadians of Ukrainian origin came from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And as it turned out, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was at war against Canada. Therefore, residents coming from that empire were deemed to be a priori suspect. Now, there were also about 2,000 approximately residents of German or Germanic Austrian origin who were also interned, but usually for much briefer periods of time and usually in much more lenient circumstances. In the very corrosive language of the time, these residents from German or Germanic ancestry were deemed first class. First class. And when they were not interned and forced to do work in their camps. They were interned for a certain period. Their loyalty and military loyalty or honesty was ascertained, and then they were quietly released. Unfortunately, residents from Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, Bulgaria, were not deemed first-class immigrant, and they were not only interned, but they were in forced labor camps. There is quite a large map being showed in the exhibition showing the 24 camps scattered across Canada from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. In the language of the time, these camps were sometimes called receiving stations. Well, some of these internees were received for a solid 5 years. Men only, and a good deal of these camps were in Western Canada, particularly Alberta, as it happens. And a great deal of the Rocky Mountain National Camps and the road and all the infrastructure was created, unfortunately, by these Canadian residents, very often of Ukrainian origin, being held, of course, against their will for up to 5 years in these camps. So that's a dark chapter in Canadian history that we attempt to present as objectively and fairly as possible. And we devote some panels and some explanations to that, Lynn, because it is not a very well-known chapter of Canadian history. When I did study Canadian history at a relatively advanced level in the 1980s and early 1990s, to be honest, I had never heard about that topic because the Canadian government, obviously, after the First World War was over in the 1920s, wasn't too proud of what it had done, and it literally, physically erased the camps and erased all material or physical traces of these internments. And the vast majority of Ukrainian Canadians and other Canadians of Eastern European lineage who were thus interned also wanted to forget about this stain and these lost years of their life and of their youth. And also they wanted to integrate as fully as they could into the mainstream of Canadian society, just to make sure that this nightmare that they had experienced would simply be consigned to history. Very often the internees were not very loquacious or talkative about their dark experiences in the First World War year. Very often it is the children of internees who begged their parents, their fathers, to tell them more about what they had experienced. For instance, the exhibition puts the spotlight on some individuals, with names and pictures, because sometimes, Lynn, when we talk about history, we talk about, big features, important measures, numbers, we show maps, and that's all very good. But it's also very good to keep in mind, you see, we have names here: Mary Bayrack, George Forchuk, Claudius Brown, and all that. It's important to keep in mind that all these important measures which we talk about are applied, we say in French, in flesh and bone, en chair et en os, with actual people who undergo these experiences. George Forchuk is one such unfortunate individual. He was simply an ordinary farmer immigrant from Ukraine who arrived in Canada in 1913, just before the war. He was granted a certain plot of land in Alberta, if I'm not mistaken. He was interned during the war, I think in the Jasper camp. He managed to escape and to establish a new life for himself, and he married in 1920 and almost did not speak of his experience to his children. But he had to change his name to make sure he completely wanted to turn that page on that chapter of history, and did not even reveal to his family what his former identity was. Such was a nightmare in his period of life that he wanted simply to seal it and to bury his past. And unfortunately, what George Forchuk experienced was experienced by a few thousand more Canadians. And the Second World War happens 20 years after the end of the First World War. And one would think that Canadian authorities, having learned from the First World War that the tool of the War Measures Act was certainly too harsh, too blunt, too heavy a tool to be used, one would have hoped that the Canadian government, with hindsight, would have adopted a more, moderate version of the War Measures Act, enabling the government legitimately to be able to take any unforeseen measure in times of crisis and war. That's quite understandable. You cannot foresee a crisis or how it will unfold. Therefore, it may be important for a government to have some special tools at its disposal. On the other hand, the government knew that such tools could be used too bluntly and had been used too bluntly 20 years previous. Unfortunately, the War Measures Act had barely changed in a few elements of its wording, and as soon as rumors of war became concrete and nearly certain, in August 1939, the Canadian government re-invoked the act and published a series of decrees and regulations exemplifying what it would do precisely. Like the War Measures Act itself, as we recall, is merely 4 pages long. It's like a key giving access to every room. But what the government will actually do with this key was explained at long length in these regulations for the defense of Canada. There were many chapters of such regulations published throughout the war. And unfortunately, for the people who were targeted, what the War Measures Act allowed the government to do, well, the government in the Second World War certainly availed itself of doing it. We are talking about internment again, sometimes on a massive scale, forced relocation, which is a slightly softer term to designate internment or imprisonment. The exhibition has had to choose again a few major issues related to the War Measures Act during the 1939-1945 period, and we choose to focus in particular on the stories of Japanese Canadians and Italian Canadians. Japanese Canadians were, in terms of numbers, the most gravely affected of Canadian citizens during the Second World War. About 20,000 Japanese Canadians were then counted in the country, and the vast majority of them lived on the western shore of British Columbia. Well, after Japan entered into war with Canada and the United States, the Canadian government decided in its words, as a precautionary measure to forcibly relocate all Japanese Canadians many hundreds of miles or kilometers towards the far interior of British Columbia or in small communities just across the border in Alberta. The goal of such a widespread measure in the context of the time was to so it was said disable all possibility of Japanese Canadians being resident of the coast, acting as spies or traitors or facilitators for the Japanese government or Japanese army, because as we recall, Japan and Canada were at war. So Japanese Canadians, essentially, it must be said, out of deep-seated ethnic prejudice or racism that long predated the war, Japanese Canadians were deemed a priori suspect. They were deemed not entirely trustworthy or indeed not trustworthy at all. And you see, we published reproductions of very bleak signs advising all persons of Japanese racial origin in the language of the time to conglomerate in this or that area and to be transported. So we're talking about approximately 20,000 Japanese Canadians. And in this case, it's worth stressing men, women, infants, babies, grandparents, no discrimination. Unfortunately, they were all forcibly relocated deep into the interior of BC, or sometimes just across in Alberta. They were relocated usually in abandoned mining or logging villages. In the language of the time, they were relocated. They were not interned. They had a certain liberty of movement. Nevertheless, they spent the last 3 and 4 years of the war there. What is particularly cruel in their punishment is that their properties, their houses, their shops, their automobiles, their ships, were all seized, all sold, the money being held in trust by the Canadian government, supposedly for the purpose of paying for their relocation expenses and for their living expenses. So that's a particularly dark chapter of Canadian history. We have many known Japanese Canadians who have been going through this experience. We know David Suzuki, the famous scientific writer. There is also Raymond Moriyama, the famous architect. There are also people who were not particularly well known because it was really a universal method. Canadians were ashamed of what it had done way after the war. But as we will see, it took until the 1980s for the Canadian government to formally acknowledge and apologize. In the exhibition that we held at the Canadian Museum of History, we had the chance of showing 3D artifacts, in particular for some relocated Japanese Canadians, among others, Mary Kitagawa, who was then like a tiny 5 or 6 year old infant in a camp, and we have shown the sandals in the Japanese fashion. They were called getas, that their parents have fashioned for young Mary and her sisters to be worn during the summer months in order not to use their warmer shoes or boots during the winter time. So some such very modest or banal looking artifacts sometimes are revealing of what actual people experience. So, and we show a few other examples of Japanese Canadians who have went through this painful process. Unfortunately, deportation and internment did not involve only Japanese Canadians. It also involved other groups of Canadian society, among whom Italian Canadians. Again, let's keep in mind that Italy was ruled since the 1920s by a fascist regime headed by Benito Mussolini. And during the Second World War, Italy was at war against Canada, Britain, and later on against the United States. As a consequence, Italian Canadians had to register among federal authorities, and about 500 to 600 of them were imprisoned, sometimes for a few weeks, sometimes for a few years. Officially, the reason for the imprisonment of between 500 and 600 Italian Canadians was their alleged friendship towards fascism. But more often than not, the Italian Canadians being interned perhaps had a sort of naive and uninformed pride for the fascist regime, as they thought they knew it through its propaganda, but had absolutely no intention of ever acting in any way disloyally towards Canada, since it was the country that they had decided to settle in. And many Italian Canadian detained individuals had not an inkling of sympathy for fascism. Such is the case of the artist that we have highlighted here, Vincenzo Poggi. In fact, he was beaten in his internment camp by fellow Italian Canadians who, in that case, were genuinely of fascist persuasion, but Poggi was not at all. Nevertheless, he spent, I think, 2 full years imprisoned through dubious denunciations. This is what happens when an act gives the government, unlimited power to arrest, detain, or seize anyone without having to prove anything in a court of law. Human errors in great quantities were made. And of course, since it was all legal, the government of the time did not apologize for it at all. Again, official Canadian acknowledgement for the harm it inflicted on Italian Canadians would come much later in the 1990s and after. Yeah, in the 3D version of the exhibition that we held at the Canadian Museum of History until 2022, we had the possibility of showing a few material objects, among which the prisoner bag of Vincenzo Poggi. Since he was an artist, he managed to ornate and to paint him himself. The October crisis was the third and last period where the War Measures Act was invoked in Canada. It started quite abruptly in 1970. Canada was then experiencing a crisis that it had never lived through before. The 1960s were a very feverish period. We tend to think of the sunny, happy side of the 1960s, and of course, it was for many people just a lively season full of youth, liberty, and experiment. But the 1960s was also marked by race riots in the United States, very serious political unrest in France and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, and the beginning of the troubles in Ireland and elsewhere. Unfortunately, Canada and Quebec did not escape the fever of the time. In Quebec, starting in the mid-1960s, there was a militant terrorist group supporting independence called the Front de Libération du Québec, the Quebec Liberation Front. It existed alongside completely legitimate and peaceful organizations, of course, but the FLQ decided it would not abide by the democratic legal process and that it would use violent measures, explosions, bombs, detonations of all sorts. In 1970, the FLQ, Quebec Liberation Front, decided to go one step further or one step higher in the ladder, and it kidnapped two individuals, one provincial cabinet minister in the Quebec government, Pierre Laporte, and a British diplomat based in Montreal, James Richard Cross, all in the span of 1 week in 1970 to inflict a certain climate of emergency and fear. The government wanted to placate, of course, the situation. The government wanted to find the two hostages. They had no idea where they were hidden. And what proved very worrying for the federal authorities was that the FLQ couched its actions in the terms of popular liberation or popular freedom, and especially among the youth, the radical youth, the students, and some progressive movements of the time. It became a certain trend to affirm that people did not share the means, used by the FLQ. Nobody approved the kidnapping of people, but as it happened in the times, many people supported the general social, political, or economic goals of the FLQ, radical socialism and decolonial independence for Quebec. The situation became quite restless, especially in Montreal, and the government had trouble to juggle it. The Quebec government had difficulty, the city of Montreal had difficulty to restore order. So what happened is that the mayor of Montreal and the premier of Quebec appealed to the federal government, headed by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, then Justin Trudeau's father, to invoke the War Measures Act. The goal of the War Measures Act, it was not to be applied strictly in times of actual warfare, but there was also a clause saying it could be used in times of insurrection, real or apprehended. Well, in the language of the time, there was an apprehended insurrection. There was general fever in the streets and everywhere. Two individuals had been kidnapped. The police was powerless to find them. As a first stage, the army was sent in Quebec not to rule the province, but simply to guard buildings, to passively guard buildings, houses, electric dams, and other such facilities to enable police to deploy and do their work. As it happened, it did not suffice. So the Trudeau government did enact the War Measures Act in the middle of October 1970 to enable itself to imprison people that they deemed suspect, and without bothering to have them put on trial and having access to a lawyer and so on. So the War Measures Act was invoked in mid-October. About 450 people in Quebec were imprisoned because of that. Sometimes the detention period would be literally a few hours. Sometimes they would not spend a night in jail. Sometimes, however, they would spend up to, I think the maximum was 5 months of jail time before they were released. Very few of these 450 people being detained were formally accused of anything. And I think less than a handful were convicted of wrong actions, usually unrelated to the kidnappings themselves. We talk about 450 people being imprisoned. Pauline Julien, the singer, is one of them. And let's not forget also the free pass, if I may say, that the federal government had to seize homes. About 30,000 homes were visited and seized. It was really a climate of extreme anxiety in Quebec. Given that the police forces were given unlimited access to all the households and all of the individuals that it could either detain in the case of person or search and seize in the case of homes, of course, inevitably, excesses were committed. Among the 450 people being detained, a certain number certainly had links to the Front de Libération du Québec, and it can be argued with fairness that in some cases, interrogation was appropriate. However, a great many of the detained people, such as Pauline Julien, the singer, was of vaguely progressive and pro-unions, pro-trade unions, and pro-independence sympathy, but had, of course, never held a weapon or a bomb in their hands throughout their life. Pauline Julien was simply a very well-known and glamorous and popular Quebec singer who happened to espouse left-wing or progressive causes. Nevertheless, she was detained for a period of 8 days, I think, and so was her spouse, Gérald Godin, who was then a publisher and poet and would eventually become a Parti Québécois member of the Assembly and provincial cabinet minister. So Pauline Julien was already of progressive sympathies and in favor of strikers and social movements before her imprisonment in October 1970. But after she was released, she became even more resolute and adamant in her support for radical, progressive, and separatist causes. And that may have been one of the ironical side effects of applying the War Measures Act to address what was, of course, we all agree, a very serious crisis. By using a very strong tool to address a situation, the government may have unwillingly encouraged the growth of pro-independence sympathies in Quebec. So certainly, the support for Quebec independence grew considerably between 1970 and the years to come. In the language of the times, Tommy Douglas was then the federal leader of the New Democratic Party, and he then accused the federal government of Pierre Trudeau, in his words, I think, of using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut. So these are his words. And so we show a few instances of individual people. Serge Mongeau, he was a community type of medical doctor. Michel Chartrand, a trade unionist. Nick Aufdermore, who was an English language sort of freewheeling progressive journalist who just happened to know many FLQ and radically independent, pro-independence people as drinking or social companions. But he was imprisoned all the same, just in case. And I said a little bit earlier that fortunately for our moral standing, Canada eventually acknowledged and formally apologized for its actions during the First World War and Second World War concerning many ethnic and national communities unfairly targeted. Japanese Canadians were the first such community to receive a formal acknowledgement from the federal government in 1988. The Prime Minister of the time, Brian Mulroney, whom we see formally signed a statement of recognition, apology, and redress, accompanied by way overdue financial compensation about 43 years after the end of the Japanese-Canadian nightmare. Other communities eventually were acknowledged of that nature. The federal government, headed by Brian Mulroney, also has the enviable role of having disposed of the War Measures Act for once and for all. It had been, adopted, as we said, in August 1914. It had changed by a few words here and there, but essentially it had remained on the books up to 1988. But the federal government in 1988 at last abrogated it, or if you want, cancelled it, and replaced it by a softer act, so to speak, called the Emergencies Act. So that dates from 1988. And as we may recall, the Emergencies Act has never been used by the federal government from its adoption in 1988 until a very recent past, the winter of 2022, when there was unrest in February across the country, particularly in the national capital, Ottawa, but also in various areas here and there in Canada, in Alberta, as we know, also on the Windsor-Detroit border, in a few other locations. In the context of the time, the federal government deemed that the situation was serious enough to warrant invoking that Emergencies Act, which had not been used yet for its first 34 years of existence. And when we started to do work on the exhibition in the summer of 2018, when we had brainstormed among ourselves, and you are on exhibition teams, Lynn, we sometimes try to wonder, okay, how will we ensure that the public is interested in the story? Because for us, people who love history, who love the past, and who love heritage, anything that happened in the past can be interesting. We just have to explain it, present it in a lively, human, accurate, matter. But we thought, well, the War Measures Act is an old, dusty chapter that was like abrogated in 1988. What it dealt with happened in the First World War and the Second World War in 1970. Like, that's old stuff. Of course, little did we know that when COVID-19 popped on the scene in the first month of 2020, with a certain number of difficult measures that both provincial and federal governments put into place, well, little did we know that there was a parallel that would be evident in the eyes of many people. We can never compare two situations from the distant past and from the near present. We have this saying in French, maybe you have it in English as well. Comparison is not reason. Nevertheless, there is a comparison to be made, both in the three historical eras that we talked about and in the COVID-19 period. In all of these moments, there were genuinely a crisis situation. And furthermore, the crisis was unforeseen, and there was no accepted recipe book to address that crisis. And the arguments used by governments of the time was quite strikingly similar. Essentially, it's a variation upon the same theme of, with extraordinary situation comes the need for extraordinary measures. Such was the reasoning, perhaps justified, perhaps not. I try not to be a judge, I'm merely a historian, but such was the justification being provided by our governments in the recent period. A crisis situation, bring it with it unforeseen and unknown consequences, warrants particularly novel and perhaps stark measures. Various vaccine mandates, various restrictions to intra or interprovincial travels, imposition of mask wearing, and so on, and a very significant measure being put in place for, I think, the span of 8 days, the invocation of the Emergencies Act in February 2022. So the contexts are not identical. There was no war in Canada between 2020 and the recent period. Nevertheless, there was a crisis, the ingredients of which were not known in advance. And in all of these situations, the government acted with a certain haste and in a certain uncertainty due to the novel nature of what it was facing. I think I spoke enough, Lynn, but I thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Xavier. That was excellent. You did a great recount of the War Measures Act in World War I, World War II, and of course in the October crisis. Thank you, Kim, for being in the galleries and panning through and being, the steady visual and showing some highlights of the panel exhibit on display. I will close down Kim for now. Thank you, Kim. And we will go on to the Q&A for Xavier. I don't see any comments or questions in the chat box yet, but please, at any time, just put your question into the chat box and I will address it. So, Xavier, I think I like the way you wrapped up and explained how, as a historian, you're not here to judge, you're here just to recount history. And the thing that I really like about the exhibit, Lost Liberties, is the fact that you're showing two perspectives. You're showing the perspective of the government in all three instances, World War I, World War II, and the October crisis, and what their views were, and seeing the crisis as it was, and their perspective on why they felt it necessary to invoke the War Measures Act in all three instances. But then you do a great job of showing some personal stories of how those effects affected everyday people, the short-term effects, the long-term effects in all three situations. So I think that's what's so well done about this exhibit. Now, I have a third perspective to ask you, especially for the October crisis, the last one. What was the global perspective of how people thought of Canada, or what the government did in invoking the War Measures Act when they were witnessing the terrorists of the FLQ in Montreal? Do you have any evidence of what the globe, what the world views of Canada was at that time?
Yes, but my answer will perhaps offend our national pride. The world in general did not pay an inordinate amount of attention to what was occurring within Canada, if it was not of unprecedented importance. The world had paid significant attention to, for instance, Expo 67, occurring in Canada 3 years previously, and had paid enormous attention to the French president's speech in 1967. President Charles de Gaulle, when he visited Montreal and had his famous rallying cry, "Long live free Quebec." It was quite special for a French president to be greeted in a foreign country and to incite a section of that country to separate from the rest. But the sad reality is that the rest of the world, the rest of the Western world, underwent lots of political trauma in the late 1960s. So the fact that there were two personalities being kidnapped in Quebec, and the fact that there were soldiers on the street everywhere in Quebec, especially in urban Quebec, was certainly treated in the news. But don't forget, this is the time, for instance, of the essentially race and social riots in our neighboring country, the United States, riots lasting sometimes for many bloody days and nights. Detroit, Watts, Los Angeles, Newark, and others. So Canada sort of joined the group. Canada no longer could claim it was a lily white, innocent nation. Canada, unfortunately, was tainted by the same malaise afflicting most of the Western world in the late 1960s.
That's a good perspective. So they're just looking at us as being similar to the States and the violence taking over.
Yeah. Oh,
The,
but if I may, before I finish, the Minister of Justice at the time of the October crisis was John Turner, who would become known later on as leader of the Federal Liberal Party and very briefly Prime Minister of Canada. But I think Turner put it well when the brunt of the crisis was over. He declared something like, "Well, there was a before and there will be an after." October 1970 is when Canada lost its innocence. And I will add that it's also the moment that Canada lost its vanity or smugness. Because for a long time, Canada saw what was happening, for instance, in the US, assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, all of these racial riots, the Kent State situation in Ohio. And Canada congratulated or patted itself by saying, hey, we may have our worries, but essentially we are a decent civil society. Well, unfortunately, the cover on the coffee pot burst here as well.
we're no longer the peaceful country we thought we were.
Yeah.
It's interesting too that the polls in during the October crisis was there's 87% of Canadians agreed that the government should go ahead and evoke the War Measures Act, which is a really high percentage. Now, this crisis was only happening in Quebec, in Montreal. So how did the Western Canadians feel about the War Measure Act happening, being evoked when they were so far away from it and not a part of it? Did they find that any of their civil liberties were taken away out in the West?
There were essentially hints or possibility or threats of that, but nothing of consequence actually happened outside the boundaries of Quebec and the city of Ottawa. There was the mayor of Vancouver, whose name I forget, who was particularly opposed to the hippies and the long hair, unwashed peaceniks, making his city a sort of tiny San Francisco of the North. And I think I recall that he threatened to use the vast measures of the War Measures Act to clean the city. Essentially, not much happened. Censorship, which is one of the tools enabled or permitted by the act, censorship was used, for instance, to seize a few student newspapers. Again, in Vancouver, UBC Simon Fraser. I don't think it had an impact at all in Alberta. Essentially, west of Ottawa or west of Toronto, if you want, the level of familiarity with Quebec issues in 1970 was understandably not very high. There were the proverbial two solitudes, as we used to say, the language barrier, and normal people in English Canada essentially had their lives to live and did not follow the news with the obsession that we now have with social networks or cable television and so on. So the average Canadian citizen had a general awareness of the Quebec situation, a cultural and political discontent. Yes, maybe average Canadians knew that there were the occasional outburst of violence, explosions here and there, but were not intimately familiar with the climate and the fever on the street. Therefore, when the federal cabinet deemed the situation serious enough to impose the War Measures Act, Canadians from coast to coast were struck, and they hadn't seen it coming at all. As it happens, the ministers coming from Quebec were the most forceful in demanding that the federal government invoked the act. Most of the ministers come from outside, did not see the situation as critical enough to warrant using again the sledgehammer.
Mhm.
The opinion polls that you refer to is completely scientific. It's too bad that we could not have comparable opinion polls for the First World War and the Second World War situation. Again, censorship of the press was extremely strong in the First World War and the Second World War. Not so in the October crisis situation, where by and large, uh, the newspapers, be they student newspapers or mass newspapers, could essentially express themselves freely. For the first two world wars, censorship was very effective, if I may say so. Therefore, the Canadian public opinion was largely molded or shaped by what it was allowed to, to read or to hear on the radio. So I suspect that a scientific poll would have shown an overwhelming support for the repressive measures, which, of course, the government did not show as repressive but protective. In the October crisis period, 1970, then the Gallup polls and other public opinion polls were quite like we have today. And the 87% figure that we refer to, refers to a poll taken, I think, in early December. So the dust had the time to settle. It was nearly 3 months after the act was invoked, and Canadians were quite well informed by then. They had more than 2 months to make up their minds, watch television, radio, talk to their neighbors, read the alternative press if they felt like it. Nevertheless, although the opponents were very vocal and very eloquent, essentially the progressive civil liberties minded people, well, the silent majority, as we say, was considerably in favor of the measures taken by the Trudeau government. It was the time where people would write lots of letters and send telegrams to their MP's office or the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Trudeau's office received, I think it was 2,000 letters, and all except about 10 were in favor of the measures he had adopted.
I'm sure it was the 450 people that were rounded up and arrested without rights that probably complained the most of the War Measures Act and their liberties being taken. The October crisis was short-lived compared to the World War I and World War II, so the liberties weren't really a long-term consequence to anybody across Canada. But I'm sure that the people that were taken, like Pauline Julien, and they suffered those the negative consequences of that for quite some time. I do have a few more questions. I still don't see anybody else chiming in on the chat. So let's go back to First World War. One story that's in the exhibit that you just touched on briefly was the story of Claudius Brown, who is a Black man from Grenada, living in Winnipeg, who was interned for refusing to enlist in the war. Is there any other evidence of other Black or ethnic Canadians that refused to enlist and that were also interned? Is he singled out because of his ethnicity, or is there any other reason why they chose to intern Claudius Brown?
It is true, Claudius Brown, whom we highlight as a case study, so to speak, was a Black man, but his racial background was sort of incidental or accidental to the broader story. He was particularly a Jehovah's Witness, and the government had allowed for a certain number of religious persuasions to be exempted from having to enlist and fight, and the Jehovah's Witness were not formally recognized. So there were only like a few stated sects or religions which allowed their members not to be able, not to enlist. So the Jehovah's Witnesses were particularly targeted during the war because they were in a no man's land.
So, which were the religious groups that the Canadian government allowed to not, or said that they didn't need to enlist? Was it the Mormons or the Hutterites?
Yeah, the Hutterites and other denominations, particularly present in Western Canada and rural Ontario, coming from Germany and Russia, and I think the Hutterites certainly, and the Doukhobors, if I'm not mistaken, too.
Okay, good. Thank you. In the Second World War, the government, with the Japanese internment, the government chose the BC interior, such as small isolated communities like New Denver and Greenwood, for some of these internment camps. And on your website, you have this wonderful video that I recommend people to go on to the Canadian Museum of History to watch this website. It's a classic Canadian propaganda of making the Japanese internment camps look a little bit like a tourist vacation. But why was it that they chose those locations? Was it because they were so remote and isolated from people? Or was there another reason why they wanted to move all the Japanese, whole families, to these isolated communities and intern them there?
The main reason was to have the Japanese Canadian population out of harm's way, so to speak. There was also the practical convenience that these sort of half-defunct villages, had in existence. The government did not have to build everything from scratch. Unfortunately, the National Film Board documentary that we show with caution, of course, on our website, and it's also available on the NFB website. Shows a happy group of individuals enjoying life in the outdoors. It's a very cruel irony of history.
Mm-hmm. I imagine that some of those small towns were also logging camps and orchards, so they probably use them as for labor for those locations as well.
Yes, because it was so remote and inaccessible that the Japanese Canadians had a certain freedom of movement, within the vast areas where they were relocated. The government also hoped that eventually the Japanese Canadians would settle across the country, as opposed to be concentrated on the shores of British Columbia. We must add that the drastic measures taken in, I think, 1942 by the federal government followed decades of mistrust and resentment by the dominant population of British Columbia vis-a-vis what they call the Orientals, Chinese Canadians or Japanese Canadians. It's a long story of mistrust and suspicion, despite the fact that many Japanese Canadians, most of them, had never set foot in Japan, and most of them, or many of them, could not even speak the Japanese language or read it. Essentially, they were as integrated as they could be, but that wasn't even sufficient. That wasn't judged sufficient to allay the fears and the prejudice of a great deal, unfortunately, of old stock British Columbians. So the war situation served as a catalyst or a facilitating pretext, sort of taking into account this hostility that had been a long brewing process.
And I think it was even sadder after the war that they were forced to relocate, as you mentioned, east of the Rockies to settle across Canada. But those that chose not to were deported back to Japan. What was the percentage of Japanese that were deported back to Japan, and why would they choose that if they were born in Canada over settling in the East? Was it just a financial reason? Because I know they've lost their homes, they lost their farmland, everything was seized from them and sold, and they're starting all over again. So was there any particular reason why some of these Japanese Canadians would choose to be deported instead of resettling?
Yeah, those who went to Japan. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers at the tip of my fingers. In the language of the times, they when they moved to Japan, they agreed to return to Japan. Of course, many were third generation
Mm-hmm.
Japanese Canadians who could not return to a country. Many decided to, after all, take the offer and go to Japan because they had been singled, targeted negatively for many years, isolated as Japanese. We remember the placards and posters that we see, and many thought among themselves, well, at least there I will no longer be a foreigner. I will no longer be singled out, treated with suspicion and mistrust, and bullied and all that. And I may start a new life and just live my life normally. Of the certain number who did settle to Japan around 1945, 46, 47, a certain number returned to Canada afterwards because they could not settle and blend well in Japan because they had no personal connection with the country. Don't forget the country had also been ravaged and damaged by bombing. And I think the Japanese society after 1945 was not in a situation economically and even socially to open its arms to waves of newcomers. So sad story and even sad conclusion. But fortunately for Canada's honor, uh, sa- a, a honorable ultimate chapter in 1988 with our official national recognition and apology.
Thank you. And in contrast, for the Italians that were interned, you mentioned that it was 500 or 600 Italian men that were sent to internment camps in World War II, but it was only the men and it wasn't the women and children. For the Japanese, they interned the entire families, but for the Italians, it was just the men. Um, Now, on one hand, it was probably better that the women and children weren't interned, but on the other hand, they struggled because they've lost their breadwinner, and the women and children. And there's that story where the child had to go to orphanages because the parents couldn't, or the mother couldn't take care of them. So neither situation was better. But why did the government not intern the entire families for the Italians like they did for the Japanese?
Well, I can answer with some irony that it was judged to be unfair and incorrect because the women could not possibly have espoused um, fascist leanings because they were the wives of. Such
Mhm.
was the context of the time, and they could not do harm militarily and in terms of espionage and sharing secret information and so on. So sexism was one part of it, and also somebody had to take care of the children. So that's the reason why mothers, spouses, and the children were spared. Their material circumstances were extremely fragile. They depended on the community and parish network to survive. Don't forget, although it's a period where more and more women would tend to work outside the household due to the pressure of war and to the fact that many men were fighting overseas. It, Nevertheless, the 1940s were still a moment when it was not completely accepted and normal for a woman to earn to be a breadwinner outside the home, and there were the children to take care of. So, fortunately, family, kinship networks, parish, ethnic community associations managed to put some bread on the table, but economically, it was a very challenging situation for the Italian Canadian families in question.
Thank you. And lastly, during World War II, You did have one story of Stony Point, the Indigenous community who lost their land for the Ippewash camp that was set up. Do you have any other evidence and stories of how the War Measures Act affected the Indigenous people in anywhere else in Canada?
Yes, there is a reserve, and if I'm not mistaken, it is not that far from you in Alberta, Kainai, the land of which was appropriated in the First World War uh, by the federal government with no compensation or anything. The Stony Point Reserve was another example in the Second World War. That's the that's it, it is to show the breadth and depth of the War Measures Act that it enabled the government to appropriate whatever it saw fit for the national good in terms of war or insurrection or fear of insurrection. If the government wanted to seize a parcel of land, it just did. We we particularly devote more time to the Stony Point question because the situation, unfortunately, persisted, not finally solved until the years 2018, if I'm not mistaken. There was a First Nations reserve near Sarnia in southwest Ontario. People were forcibly relocated to a nearby reserve of a friendly but different community. They were just told to blend there because national defense needed a place to operate a camp, and a provincial camp was also established. And the promise was that the First Nations community would get its land back after the war. Well, in the 1990s, a documentary was done by CBC, and one of the people, the descendants of the people being displaced, said, well, the war must have lasted a very long time because after 50 years, the land has not been retroceded yet.
Okay, thank you. I find this is the last question that I have for you to end our session. I'd just like to hear your thoughts and your comparisons, because you talked about how there's always comparisons in history, that the similarities and differences between the War Measures Act and, as you call it, the softer version, the Emergency Measure Act. Could you explain those differences to us?
Yes, I will try to do it as best and as simply as I can, and it will be relatively easy to be simple because I'm not a lawyer by training. So I won't even have to simplify uh, my language. It will be simple naturally. The War Measures Act was not subject to any check and balance.
Right.
It simply said when the government decides to adopt an order in council or a decree, it may do so. And the tribunal may well examine this, but they will be forced to give way to the government's wishes at all times. Whereas uh, the Emergencies Act has entrenched checks and balances to prevent it from going uh, from operating in an excessive way. The first such inner protection is that it is explicitly subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, adopted in April 1982. And of course, the famous charter did not exist in the past. So it is completely clear that the Emergencies Act operates within or under the general roof or umbrella of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So already you have a certain restriction or of the ambit of what it can do and not do. Also, the Act cannot be invoked before the government has duly consulted the provinces. They may not necessarily all agree, but all have to be informed au courant. And of course, it is expected that such mandatory consultations will enlighten the government to take the best approach. Also, the War Measures Act was, once it was invoked by the federal government, could be in place for however long the government decided. Whenever the government declared that, hey, this is wartime, people, even if the fighting had actually ended, the War Measures Act continued to be in place until or unless the government said, okay, we are done. This is why in the First World War, I think it was in 1920, that it ceased to apply. By contrast, the Emergencies Act is time limited. I think it has to be re-invoked every week, if I am correct. And I think it has to be confirmed by a vote of Parliament every week. So although in the crisis instant or hour when it is invoked, the government does not have to be on board. The Parliament doesn't have to be on board. Parliament has to agree to it within a week. And I think such parliamentary approval is mandatory regularly, as long as the government sees fit for the act to be in place. Therefore, parliamentarians don't just have their arms crossed behind their back, as was the case with the War Measures Act, where they could do and say nothing. Parliamentarians are particularly involved. And also, there are measures embedded within the new Emergency Act saying that once it ceases to be invoked, there will be a parliamentary inquiry at all times. This is what we have done, and a non-parliamentary but judicial type of inquiry being done at all times to assess what has been done, whether it was pertinent, excessive, whether laws were respected or not, etc. This is what we have seen after the invocation of the Emergencies Act in February 2022. There was both a parliamentary process examining the whole situation and a sort of judicial process headed by Justice Rouleau, who submitted his report, if I'm correct, in early 2023. So in a certain sense, the Emergencies Act contains the provisions preventing itself from committing excesses.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. That does make sense. I did read Rollo's, the Emergency Measures Act, his report, the inquires after that was invoked in 2020. But thank you, because there is so much confusion, I think, for people out there between the War Measures Act and the Emergency Measures Act and all these quick comparisons to the COVID restrictions. And it's nice to hear from you a much simpler way of explaining it. And I like the fact that you explained that it is under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and that it is a much shorter timeline. So thank you for that. I think your talk was most enlightening. I think it shed so much more information on our exhibit here in the Red Deer Museum. And I thank all the people that were on this this virtual talk today. I've seen some coming in and out, and so it's great to see you here. This will be shared on our YouTube station afterwards, so people can access it at any time and listen to Xavier Gélinas' great insights on the War Measures Act and the 3 times that Canada has invoked it. Thank you very much for joining us, Xavier. I really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit more and getting to know some of your answers and responses. I thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks to you for your patience, Lynn.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you, and we'll sign out. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining.